Hi, everyone. My name is Will. Hi, everyone. My name is Will, and I'm the copywriting and design assistant at the Poetry Project. I'm so excited to be hosting tonight's reading with Sandra Lim and Katie Peterson. I'd also like to thank my coworker, Nicole Wallace, our event tech, James Berrickman, and our event moderator, Corey Hutchinson, for working tonight's event and for helping create and hold this Zoom room. Before we begin the evening's program, I have a few reminders to share. Corey's adding a link to the chat now with some helpful Zoom tips and best practices. Please note that we are recording tonight's event. You are welcome to have your camera on or off as you prefer, but if your camera is engaged, it's possible your Zoom square will end up in the archived recording. Tonight's event is being live captioned by Otter AI, the transcript of which you may access by clicking the red live link in the top left of your screen and selecting View Stream. The transcript will subsequently open in a new browser window. If you have any questions or run into any difficulties, please don't hesitate to reach out to anyone with staff or moderator after their name, and we'll be glad to get things sorted out. Corey is now adding to the chat the Poetry Project's Safer Spaces statement. Whether the room we share and make is virtual or physical, proximal or remote, we remain steadfast in building with you all a community and environment that challenges and resists ongoing, imbricated structures of hierarchy and harm. We invite you to join us in this work throughout tonight's event, and may we carry it with us well beyond this evening. If this event were taking place in person, we would be gathered together as has been done for the past 54 years at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. St. Mark's Church stands on the site of the family chapel of Peter Stuyvesant, built in 1660. In his time as Director General of New Netherland, Peter Stuyvesant began and supervised the direct chattel slave trade to New Amsterdam. He himself enslaved 40 Africans, the most of any person in the colony. These enslaved Africans' stolen lives and labor were used to construct the buildings and streets on this stolen land. St. Mark's Church is located on the unceded homeland of the Lenape people, Lenape-Hoking. I am speaking to you from what is called Bushwick, which is in the unceded homeland of the Canarsie, a Munsee-speaking band of the Lenape people. Corey is now putting a map in the chat, not to endorse it as complete, but to invite us all to learn continually about the land we occupy, its history and ties. As we gather across various neighborhoods and states, it is important to remember that it's not just some of the land that was stolen or some of the land that needs to be returned, but all of it. It reminds me too that to return the land is not a matter of transferring capitalist ownership, but as many Indigenous thinkers have explained, a radical rethinking of belonging and ownership, centering Indigenous autonomy and active relationality and responsibility. And with that, we'll begin the night's program, and we'll start with Sandra, who I'll intro, and then she'll read, and then I'll introduce Katie, and then Katie will read. I understand Sandra Lim to be a critic, a word from the Proto-Indo-European to sieve, distinguish, which I find a useful image and tool to think through the kinds of work that Sandra's poems do. Because it is a thinking through, a mindful sorting, a holding and letting go of, and watching things pass and come to pass that the poems in her latest collection, The Curious Thing, do. The collection is an exercise in active, relational observation and assessment, a sifting through of subjectivity, positionality, and the knotted emotions, desires, and experiences that make up a life lived around others and the self. Time passes in her poems as it does in life, which is to say sometimes closely, other times distantly, but more accurately, it's usually both. Time is noticed only in retrospect as a symptom of life, of love, of loss, of desire, of thought, of the banal surprise of getting older. Relationships with family, partners, friends pass through the collection as Sandra names them, sorts them, sets them down. And this work of sorting is turned inward here too. The self is not immune to the kinds of critique The Curious Thing takes up. The collection is, at turns, existing in a condition of deep solitude, wherein the lens necessarily turns inward, wherein the self necessarily becomes a separate figure through which to sort. Written in a register that excels at being both sanguine and exsanguinated, Sangra's poems build up a dialectics of desire and establish that to analyze, interrogate the logics of a life, particularly when one is not a man, runs the risk of being framed as distant, perhaps ambivalent, even difficult, but is in fact quite the opposite. Firstly, a problem here is that distant is a real feeling and necessary vantage point, but to be cast as such establishes a power structure, strips the self of autonomy over our own availability. But even more crucially, a problem with this framing is that to analyze, in fact, demands a proximity and investment, establishes a necessary appreciation. That is, distance is also a kind of proximity. That is, people, including the self, come in and out of our lives and eventually they leave. And the curious thing is that we can't stop thinking about it. And that can make things difficult. Or, as Sandra writes, in a line that I have come to hold as a personal ars poetica and take to be one of the theses of this book, I was not always kind, but I was clear. Sandra Lim is the author of 3 books of poetry, most recently The Curious Thing from W.W. Norton in 2021. Her previous books are The Wilderness, also from W.W. Norton 2014, and winner of the Barnard Women Poets Prize, and Loveliest Grotesque from Corey Press in 2006. She has received a literature award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Levi's Reading Prize, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She teaches at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's my great honor to welcome Sandra Lim to the Poetry Project.
Hello. Thank you so much, Will, for that amazing introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've always wanted to read at the Poetry Project. And I was almost losing my mind. I couldn't believe I got to read with Katie. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone joining us tonight. I was trying to figure out today what poems, what groupings of poems to read to you from The Curious Thing. And here we are in November, which I love the fall, and I love how it's getting colder actually, and how it's sort of turning our attention more inward. And so I thought I would try to read you a grouping of poems that sort of come out of how I'm feeling about November, which is to say, I always feel that there's a kind of mystery just around this time, in the coldness, in the chilliness, that feels rich, even as it feels sort of melancholy. So I'm going to start off with the first poem in the book called The Protagonists. At one time, I asked for everything. When I saw how my love was squandered, I would secrete venom. But now I sing of the fat, sleepy little censor who has replaced me, whose disappointments create the life of the house. What does the human heart love? To go, to have so far to go in deepest night. The challenge now is to convey the supreme gaiety of the heart. It is a stone flung from a volcano. Jean Rhys. It's now within an hour of sundown of a late November afternoon. It was a beautiful day. The cold burned down any indignation. What won't degrade? The sick and distant, or near and black, bad-natured tides of want. Jean Rhys is saying, if I could jump out of the window, one bang and I'd be out of it. It isn't done to admit to this kind of need, but spirit needs a house, and the brief pageant of being escorted through the grieving joy of words set down right. The cold bores her, oppresses her. Life comes to bore her. She can strip a thing down. I want beauty, she adds. Hear me? I hear you, Jean. Yours is a voice disabused, and inside the cold of it, there's a sort of festival. The Immoralists. In Goethe's famous ballad, a little heath rose tells a rough boy she'll prick him if he picks her, but he picks her anyway. Look how the erotic imagination honors you, little rose. It runs its kingly grace over you remorselessly. We go out into the light of a hot Sunday afternoon. None of us wants to grow old in a library. I'm going to read now from the long poem in the book, and it's called A Shaggy Dog Story. And I was doing a reading not so long ago where a very serious looking person came up to me afterwards and said, I found some of your poems funny. Is that all right that I found some of them funny? And I just thought, thank you. Yes, I hope so. So, and I think specifically he was talking about certain poems from A Shaggy Dog Story. So I hope you find some of them funny too. It's my permission. A Shaggy Dog Story, I'll just read out the parts, the numbered parts. 1, I am hot and tiny, yet I wrote Jane Eyre. I died on a rainy Thursday in Paris. Much later, I come home to a household laid waste by a tin of fatal corned beef. I take my pen name from a small French village. I drink like a fish. I'm always looking at the same piece of paper, giving up hope and working a little. What does art know? Sometimes it remarks, I didn't think you were like that. I thump my casing without feeling too much material, and the steady hubbub within seems off the point. All this is a pig of an undertaking just to touch thoughts. No one knows anything about life's meaning, though it all gets carted away, even the great scheme of things. 2, in the middle of my life, I felt a heave of something like nausea. My real life had really begun, no longer a speculative existence, though I still loved having a whole day ahead of me. Hurt and excited, I wanted to get everything down on the page. I was as anxious to entertain as Scheherazade, and as certain that if I failed, I would die. It seemed that anything less than that was unfair. 3, I saw my friends fall in love, their tremendous happiness, deciding upon something at the last minute. I pictured myself eating dirt. My moods were like conspirators in an opera, then strange-faced, like a jury. The view from inside was nothing but walls and drain pipes and a little sky. Florid 18th century music against taciturn furniture. and there was just me and my human concerns. 4, I fell asleep thinking heaven is renters in urban apartments, the sanctioned anonymity sharpening whatever's funny or jabbing in a person, or misapplied or ruined. Our likability having nothing to do with the legitimacy of our demands for privacy. We bandaged up the bleeding and tearful young woman from the first floor without comment on a Wednesday. I think she went to the movies about an hour later, looking as fresh as a daisy. The steadying and flushed sensation of setting forth. Whatever spring didn't restore, you sometimes felt you could with nothing left over. 5, love was losing its explanatory power, and I was beginning to smell a rat. Are we going to keep to this one grand concern like a serious drinker who sticks to one drink? Start again. Like all ideas, it appears to root and come into leaf. The transience intensifies the effects. Sometimes it even flourishes in dryness. Metaphors like this can be lazy, and I am trying to get at the work of the matter, the gap that is shaped like a person, the longing to be with and to be alone. You give time to all these things. It goes on till all hours, and somebody must clean up afterward. Then the silence begins, wonderfully, wonderfully. 6, why must I urge you to feel the smallness of your life? I think it's a pleasure of the mind like any other. I think there must be a way to care for dogs without treating them like dumb humans, though the mind is one long, unbreakable leash. The other day, my friend declared that she favored straightforward narratives, clear, unassuming, and if tart, amiably so. I felt the reproach. But style, as Diana Vreeland says, helps you get down the stairs. Seven, several months now passed without event, several years. The grubs and worms themselves tell the story, couriers with few adjectives. I think I have some capacity for abstract reasoning after the world cools its details. But I'm still having difficulty writing about time. It does not appear to be the great healer that all of us say it is. 8, and here life is going on too. A coffee pot, 4 towels, a book, a lamp, and a bed. Your ignorant hair grows long. You become drowsy with lust, with infinite dogginess. Pleasure, like a focusing lens. You admire the bold loneliness of a real life as never before. And when the world treats you well, you sometimes come to believe you are deserving of it. 9, I am traveling back to childhood. I'm going to the sea. I will throw myself down onto the rocks, down into the sea, where there are no predispositions. 10, I was face down again in the dark blue mud, where the cold and rocks and glints and verdigris tried to draw me into the passionate logic of their work. It was just after my 8th birthday. It made me shy. "What are you doing down there?" my parents asked me. They had prepared winter food, stew, crude vegetables, mung beans, but I couldn't be persuaded. The days up to then had been like pearls on a string, one no after another, until one day they were like a fire spreading, arrogant but sociable. Part of what makes life shameful and exciting is the fact of being gripped by something true that you just barely intuit. I breathed in its complex sense. This next poem is called The Mountaintop. And even though it obviously, or obviously not so obviously, refers to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, I was just thinking today I wanted to include it in sort of my November collection of poems. I was trying to get at, the poem that I actually had in the back of my head was the Montale poem, News from Amiata. Just that first section, I wanted to get at some of that, his asperity and luminousness. Mine comes out, why am I even mentioning this before I read my poem? But just full disclosure of some of that kind of mystery that I was looking for. So I was also reading it again today. Great poem, but this is The Mountaintop. In truth, you still expect to order your life in peace. You continue to long for glamour and passion, to guard against the destiny you don't really know. You work furiously. Pensive and unathletic as you are, you have your own intricate schedule with your shopping bags and appointments. You always forget you're a bag of blood. In sleep, these things lose their power over you. Meaninglessness does to you what it can. When you wake, you have no ideas. The heart is momentarily light. As you slip back into the days, you find you haven't done with certain notions yet. You read all the time. Help yourself to a plate of oysters. The dreams become fresh and astounding once more, renewed by the drama of betrayal. Even the self you take to be so real falls away while you labor. And the only stones left are the ones in your throat, foregone things you have to get down fast, or else you'll choke. At last, you don't even know what you feel for yourself. The mountaintop. You can keep your books and your music there. What's bad in one story is good in another. Something has made you brave. There's more to life than writing. I think I will just close with 2 poems. This is called That Are. Then I became this stupid trilling thing. What I desired was to become obscene. All the things I had loved up to then fell away in the long struggle between winter and spring. And then there was my body inside of my soul. It had different aspirations. What form does it take without the soul? Helpless in a hideous new way, and as patient as a mountain. The soul isn't innocent before it. So when I say stupid, I simply offer meaninglessness. And when I say trilling, I only mean a leaving off of past sound. And when I am obscene, I am shorn of all expository passages, and so on, with things that are. And I will just close with actually the last poem in the book. It's called Happiness. In the dream, I got up early and went out to shoot a rabbit because there was no meat for Sunday. It was too cold. Horses and birds were frozen solid. Nevertheless, the landscape pleased the purist in me. I put on skates to go out on the gray pond. All the while, a low fever clung to me. It was as acrid as piss, as Swedish. So I knew I still wanted to be loved. I had no reflection there, but then who could be reflected in ice? I cried in my bed. Yet, no mistaking it, it was my season. I prospered. I made endless figure eights in a strange night exhilaration. My appetite was good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that beautiful, generous reading. It's so nice to hear your new work voiced. And yeah, I'm really grateful. And now we'll turn to Katie. I'll introduce Katie, who will close out the evening. A poem story about a donkey and a girl, and I mean by that a narrative study of the nature of life and a life study of the nature of narrative. Katie Peterson's newest book, Life in the Field, is, without a doubt, weird. And to turn to etymology again, weird comes from the Old English for fate, meaning literally that which comes, with originary roots meaning to turn or bend. And this book does both these kinds of work. It is a fable about time, meaning things come to pass because they do, and the voice of the text builds a gesture towards this narrative in turns and bends, by bending both the arc of the book, but also the arc of register, toggling between the first person, second person, and third person, omniscient and limited, between the singular and plural, between philosophical and personal asides and exposition, even between the visual and the literary, as this book is threaded with an impressionistic, episodic tapestry of photographs by Young Soo. And the photographs feel beautifully and necessarily paired here, as the book mimics the work of a camera lens, focusing and refocusing, even unfocusing, the blurry sum of parts accreting into a gestural whole. Like a camera, Life in the Field also establishes a necessary kind of distance, which is to establish a perspective and demonstrates that there is a question of consent and proximity to both writing and photography. We are not let into the story of the donkey and the girl because we do not belong there. If we were let in or were to let ourselves in, the story wouldn't be there anymore. It would be our story. The donkey and the girl might leave the frame. Katie both raises and resolves this by instead letting the reader around the story, setting up camp beside the field, which is a kind of letting in. It's not that it's hard to say what Life in the Field is about, but rather that it's about everything and I don't know where to begin. But this is apt because I believe Life in the Field encourages us to abandon our ideas of aboutness and beginning, to acknowledge they are constructs, contrived to feel like we understand are understood. So inasmuch as I can stitch aboutness to this book or anything, I will say, this book is about a donkey and a girl who decide to both marry time. which is to say that it's about autonomy and joy, which is to also say that it's about nature, capitalism, democracy, patriarchy, climate catastrophe, and the end of the world. To quote the epigraph, which positions the text alongside photography as well, or rather photography plus time, meaning film. Everyone who sees this film will be absolutely astonished because this film is really the world in an hour and a half. Just read it, sit beside the field and see. Katie Peterson is the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Life in a Field and A Piece of Good News. This year, her work has appeared in the Birmingham Poetry Review, Changes Review, Interim, Literary Imagination, the New York Review of Books, Sporklit, and Sokalo Public Square. The Dots Museum in Gwangju, South Korea, presented an exhibition of her collaborations with the photographer Young Soo this fall, entitled On the Boundary. She directs the MFA program in creative writing at UC Davis. She loves the desert. I'm so grateful now to turn it over to Katie.
There is another way of looking at the story. Each stage on the journey was a blessing, and each blessing was a toll. In a fairy tale, a toll can be extracted anywhere, but bridges and ferries are favored as points of service because they so clearly literalize the emotional suspension involved in a journey. The story requires the collection of the coin. The story, not the person living the story, not the troll or ferryman, and always requires that before the passage has been accomplished. The existence of the toll assures the one who pays, you will know that you had an experience. The toll proves that the mind is very powerful. It represents the story's fear that you might go through the experience unscathed, that the world would not be enough to remind you of itself. The toll lightened from your pocket weighs on you, like the sun moving into place in the cafe, just as the argument between the not yet married couple begins. Have you ever noticed that only one letter divides them, toll and troll? You are paying your attention. And yet a mandatory mismatch accompanies the part of the story where one has to pay. Why does a traveler in a fairy tale rarely have the money to pay a toll? Indeed, it doesn't occur to most until you're actually at the bridge that a troll might even be there, let alone that he might possess the structure. And is the implication that the troll owns the bridge? It is hard to be sure. The reduction to barter in this case becomes comical for the story, but not for the traveler. You will give me all the ham you have, and I will allow you to cross my bridge. But the mind lags a little bit behind. Who says it was your bridge? No one told me about you. I have no ham. The deal made in this instance, the deal you make agreeing to pay a toll, yes, it's funny, but it's usually a deceit of a kind, a debt you'll never pay, or a debt you'll spend your life trying to get out of paying. 2 years of your life, your soul, your firstborn. Who really gives these things away? You go on, as they say, about your business, because it's not like language takes anything from you, especially a troll's garbled and anonymous speech. It's not like language takes anything from you immediately. The toll, however you pay it, says, it will not be like this forever. It will be like this a little while longer. Will, thanks for that wonderful introduction. And I wanted to read that section first because I don't know how I would have endured so many of the times in my life when it felt like it was going to be like this forever without the poet Sandra Lim. So reading here at the Poetry Project in the Invisible with her is everything she says, and I won't try to say it better. I admire her work so much, and this book is so beautiful. And Will, you have put me in a position where I cannot fail. So everything is beautiful tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people in this Zoom who I haven't seen in a while. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I want to read a section from the beginning of this book and a section from the end of this book, and then I'm going to close with a new poem. When I wrote this book, I started to think of the story itself as a poetic form. One thing I love about stories is that because we can retell them, we can make it so that they never end. And hearing all the names of the unceded lands and that in the chat, I was thinking about this as well. Right now, we seem to be retelling a lot of stories we thought we understood. In this book, I wanted to use the story from O Hazard Balthazar as a form and push against it and within it to make something new. So without further commentary, let me read this first section, kind of skirting the first two pieces of the book, and then I'll take a break and I'll say something else. And then I'll read a little bit from the end. And I never read the end, so I'm really excited to do that. And then I'm going to read one new poem. Then we can all go home. Okay. The girl is not a pretty brunette. Her hair has been bleached blonde because she likes to swim. She swims downstream from the bridge where the boys, and to be fair, their sisters, catch the small fish almost too hard to catch, so small now that the runoff from the mountains has been cut in half. Do you want to know if she swims naked? Yes, she swims naked. Do you want to know if there is a danger she could be seen? Yes, she could be seen. What is the harm in it? There has never been any harm. The donkey grew up and became himself without his mother. It was not painful. He barely thought of her. But when he saw her harnessed up to the market cart, his body stood at a form of attention more devoted than rigid, and his eyes blinked more slowly, and whatever they had been making him do, he would not do anymore for a minute or two. Usually his mother found her way out of the picture quickly enough that her son had neither to be beaten nor scolded for looking at her beauty, something his owner would have called wasting time in this instance, unless a lesson regarding getting from one point to another had been extracted. In the last scene of the sad movie, the filmmaker allows the sheep to drift around the dead donkey. The camera doesn't try to follow them. When you work with animals, they are always moving out of the picture. The donkey's mother's song, a cappella. You went and got a baby from the earth. You stuffed it up inside yourself and didn't know what it was worth. It was made of dirt. It sang a bloat, a blather, a goat-like air. You didn't want a goat, so you felt stuck. Sure, the barbs of wire on the fence sang, it was a goat. You forgot your intuition and you called that thought. You practiced goat sounds when you gave up. You ate and ate until it came out, your fear eaten by your need. You covered it and made it warm. It was not a goat, it was a life. You walked away so it could learn to walk. The story invested in return stays interested in what comes back. If you lose something, for example, if you lose a baby, you might wish for another. But if you lose another baby after that, and this time you are farther along, there are two different paths the mind might take. The first is to wish for one more baby, one that will stay and be healthy. This baby would continue the story's original intent. Its life, its teething would feel like a fulfillment, a word that has the word fill in it, the ear reminds you after you say it. The second path, well, it's not a path, it's a person. The second person wishes for two babies because now two are owed him or her. It doesn't have to be babies. A poet writes, I lost two cities, lovely ones. There could be no end to this. Two is not the last number. Two is more like the possibility of any greater number. What the story might wish for could become unwieldy and difficult to distinguish from a desire for reward. For the girl, the plot is the orchard, the abundance of this particular landscape in her blood. She does not remember a time when the harvest didn't brighten the yard she was born in sight of. The summer came with ease like a monarch taking its due. But even the best harvest yields when it gets picked to scarcity, even when that picking is appropriate, mandated, even when all is right with the gleaning. I say it was the perfect time. I say you would have said so too, but even then the fall brought rains and the winter brought the skeletons her likeness making mind would make of the natural world. Even then, the girl accommodated scarcity. The plot relies on the splitting of the second here. The plot requires you to recognize the split inside the second, when one really believes that no spring can overtake the world again. That sadness. The plot insists on this lie, the tiny crack in the best possible world that turns a wish into its opposite, that turns a desire for rebirth into a desire for escape. Because we are so far past this story, I wish to linger on it. This story is not your story. You are not meant to relate to it. You are meant to pitch a tent inside this page like a down and out person might do by the American River, under the trestle tracks, where the overgrowth and heat and greenery and shade in proximity to water makes a drought as unlikely as a marriage of equals in a century where women can't read. You are meant to believe you can live here. The Girl's Mother's Song, a cappella. How lovely the days when the girl's not a body, yet when the girl's not a shape, just a shape of a person, not the nape of her neck shining white, not an Adam's apple and evidence of a trachea, but evidence of breath, not a breathing with breasts, just a breath in the belly, a breath in me. Okay, so I'm going to read a section from the end, but before I do that, I want to show you guys what a beautiful job they did on this book, that Omnidon did on this book, because I'd love it if you wanted to pick up a copy. And it's really a collaboration with my partner, the photographer, Young Soo. He's the one who took these pictures. And I think that part of what the book does is it wants you to have these natural divisions in between moments of the book. I write a lot of poems that have something to do with stories, and I always feel half ashamed of it, because what I was taught about poetry is that lyric and narrative are opposites of some kind, right? That if you write poetry, you're not supposed to write narrative, that poetry is all about the moment. But I had this thought today when I was thinking about the book, that sometimes the moment is too hard to take, or it's blinding, too hard to see. And that something that narrative can do is it can take a moment and slow it down and put it into pieces. So I want to read a piece from the ending of the book in which there's a little more plot than what's gone before. And I hope you like it. And then I'll take a break and say something else and read one poem, and then we can all hang out. And just the last thing is so much of the book, I think, has to do with the tough things that happen, as Will eloquently said, when you're not a man. Like lots of girls, she thought about running away. Rucksack made of hobo handkerchief tied to a stick, one change of clothes, a pack of matches, a few tins of sardines, then off. The open road, bedtime whenever she wanted it to be. In another version, the big city. Her name in lights, she'd make it, she'd show them all. But to tell oneself the story, you must deny reality. You must believe the road is not dangerous, or invent in the city a safe house for girls. Still, when the girl dreamed of running away, it was the guilt that kept her from doing it, not the logistics. The long faces of her parents, her mother's face floating ghostly on the other side of the window, the one with the planter box of geraniums framing her family kitchen. How unfair. Denying reality is a privilege of the imagination, like the right to freely assemble, like the right to vote. Everyone deserves it. In that place, at that time, there was no shortage of fields. They surrounded the town, insulated it, like snow would have done if the town had grown in a snowy place. The fields were not public spaces exactly, but sort of. You had to trespass, but everyone did it. You had to trespass, but the lines were unclear. You had to trespass, but to be caught did not even mean a reprimand. If anything, it meant being offered a drink of water. Of course, generosity might have its own consequences. Ownership doesn't determine everything, says the bright sun shining on the star mark that crosses the back of the donkey. I wanted to let go of sugar and eat everything else. I estranged myself from bread. Enough eating Christmas for this bloodstream, enough celebration for this liver, enough appetite. I looked for something else. I would have done anything. This is the nature of a bargain. You would do anything, and then you are asked to do a specific thing you do not wish to do. This is the difference between me and the donkey, whose opposite I am. The donkey doesn't want to do anything but eat. She's saying no work, or is it no worse? Is she quoting or saying something like a prophecy? When she makes the words with her mouth, her eyes light up, and the donkey exhibits stereotypical behavior, and she believes she experiences love, or at least the aftermath of beauty, which is love's opposite. Opposite because beauty makes you greedy, and love repurposes your greed as selflessness. They cannot even go for a walk together. A walk together doesn't even make sense. She can read to him, but he won't read back. But maybe for the donkey, memory is a form of reading. When she touches his neck, he remembers that another good person did so. He puts together then with his imagination, a la Ignatius Loyola, the original scene of goodness. The original scene of goodness is a person taking mercy on a donkey as his mother was led away to another field. A human who knew enough to say sorry, and maybe draw his or her hand along the neck to indicate to the young donkey, a child, that warmness still existed in the world. The original scene of goodness involves a stranger. The original scene of goodness isn't a family. Money isn't hidden from the original scene of goodness, but there's also another currency. Since the girl and the donkey are friends, they must have examined each other. They must have seen each other's bodies. Their differences when they examined each other, however, went unexplored. Rain, snow, the curses of the old, the laughter of the young, the world went on because a current of love secretly makes the world go on. Picnic in the one dry spot on the wet field. Point out the flowers to each other. Deny the existence of anything other than a perfect summer. The donkey baby had no name. Once born, he had less than that, a name bestowed out of just enough care. A name must worry in excess about its own appropriateness in order to truly count. To name someone himself, to donkey a donkey, has an apt simplicity but isn't anything really. On the other hand, to name a girl means a girl must appear. For instance, if you were to name a girl Francesca Joy, if that was the name you might choose, you might imagine lace in her future, but you wouldn't doubt her nerve. If you were to name her Emily, you might imagine the lace to take a more geometric shape. In any scene on the beach, Emily would run. To go back to Francesca Joy for a minute, you might doubt she was a runner. So let us name her Emily instead, and maybe the joy can be implied. Let us not gild the lily. Our first try tried too hard. Our second try has given birth to something small. Now we must try again. What does the other hand look like? Is it a left hand? Why does it always come in to remind you of the way things don't have to happen? Is there a way things don't have to happen? After all, what is a girl if no young man appears? Happy. But how long can they stand in the field like that, her arms around his neck, her ear looking for his heart? He will get restless and uncomfortable. She will become tired of this gesture. Time will once again turn our interpretation of this pose, this flirtation with the ridiculous, converted into pity, into impatience and a bad smell. Her ear will sweat. But for now, let them have it. Let civilization have the original scene of goodness. the story frozen in place before it has to happen. But in this version, the girl speaks. The sky is falling, she says to him. Just yesterday, I saw a piece of it hit the lake on the far side of town and land in the form of a cloud. The ground seizes up in drought. Just yesterday, I saw cracks in the earth. Yesterday, brush fires followed by downpours, then immediate flooding. All the more reason to talk about flowers. I will place bunches of them around your bridle. I will weave them through your harness. They will not constrain you. I will make a bouquet of many colors for you to eat. So I don't quite want to give away the ending, but I do realize that I live in California, and I've given the impression sometimes in this book that a field is a wonderfully green thing. And some of you know, I spent years living in a place in which the field and the desert were basically contiguous. And so I just wanted to close by reading a poem about that place. And I also wanted to kind of close by going back into poetry and into the poetic line as a way of saying goodnight to all of us a little more gently. So thank you, everyone at the Poetry Project, and thank you, brava, to the brilliant Sandra Lim. This poem is called Second Family. I lived on a farm. It was my second family. It was also a school that educated men to be servants to humanity. I talked about it like it was my home. Between the wars, Freud writes to his friend, he does not believe in God, but can recognize that others have experienced an oceanic feeling, a fantasy of life within the womb. An animal once told me how to feel, a black and white member of my second family. She dropped a wet calf on my birthday, walking away as it called for her. I loved the womb more when I had to use it. Sitting at the teaching table at the school where my second family lived, my girl kicked me while I lectured. The middle child of a firstborn mother, I lived as other, without black sheep power, on the lookout for my second family since the first Christmas I moved lambs to the manger. Everyone should learn to feed the animals. The object was to farm a piece of desert, growing food and feed out of necessity. No Swiss-made sweet milk. Ours was saged. Young men covered in sour milk from mornings early in the dairy, no time for laundry, arguing against the oceanic feeling. And there I was, a Russian doll, Matryoshka. I saw inside her another family, another and another and another, so on, like a repeating decimal. The more we talked, the more the baby kicked. Where is your home? Where are you going? I see you are like me, stranded, buoyed only a little, only a decimal's worth, by that perishable angel, the passage of time, who does not discriminate. I said to my girl, could not hear words yet, just sounds, with the voice you use when you are talking silently, within a family, a country, a world, to someone you already love. I learned this voice from my second family. Julian made a speech about the wind. Abram cooked masterpieces for children. Alexander double dug the garden beds. Justin built a cabin with no walls. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. That was amazing. It was so good to hear Life in the Field, and also that closing poem is fantastic. And Yeah, I'm just so grateful for this whole night. Thanks to you both, and like so happy to have heard your poems like spoken alongside each other and to like think about them together as I have done before and will continue to do. Yeah. Um, so that concludes the evening, and then I suppose we'll ask everyone to unmute for a moment so you can sing your praises. Turn your video on if you want. Don't be shy. Yeah, and we'll hang out for a moment or two, and then we'll all disappear.